Richard Hale wasn't just a husband and father. He was a ghost wearing a perfect smile. A man who built his life from lies so flawless that even the FBI believed they were real. In the quiet suburbs of Charleston, South Carolina, Richard Hale appeared to be the definition of the perfect man. He was the kind of neighbor everyone admired. Friendly, hard-working, and always willing to lend a hand. His two-story house sat neatly at the end of Willow Creek Lane, its white porch and manicured lawn reflecting the order and precision of the man who lived there. Every morning, Richard could be seen jogging through the neighborhood, waving to dog walkers and exchanging brief greetings with the mail carrier. To those who knew him, he was a devoted husband, a caring father, and a man whose life seemed to be built on honesty and discipline. Richard's wife, Laura, adored him. She often told her friends how lucky she felt to have married such a dependable man. Together, they had 2 young children, Emma and Jacob, who attended the local private school. Their family photos, framed in perfect symmetry on the living room wall, painted a portrait of happiness. Every detail of their life seemed flawless, the kind of picture that made others quietly envious. On weekends, the Hale family hosted barbecues where laughter echoed through the yard and the smell of grilled steaks filled the air. Richard would flip burgers while telling stories about his work as a financial consultant, speaking with an ease and confidence that made people trust him without question. But beneath that flawless surface, Richard was living a lie so intricate that even those closest to him had no idea. His job, the very one that paid for their home and comfortable lifestyle, wasn't what it seemed. Officially, he managed investments for wealthy clients. In reality, he was manipulating identities, forging financial documents, and moving stolen funds through digital labyrinths that only he could navigate. His real income didn't come from clients. It came from the victims of identity theft, scattered across different states. Using a network of fake accounts and ghost companies, he built a steady stream of illegal earnings that funded every luxury in his family's life. Richard's brilliance lay in his ability to blend the ordinary with the extraordinary. He kept a spotless record, paid taxes on time, and made modest donations to local charities. These gestures created an image of decency that made suspicion almost impossible. He even volunteered at his children's school, presenting himself as a model father. When his wife questioned his frequent business trips, he had detailed explanations and printed itineraries to show her. Every lie was supported by another lie, carefully layered like bricks in a wall that no one could see through. At night, after everyone had gone to bed, Richard would retreat to his home office. The glow of his computer screen was the only light in the room. There, he became someone else entirely, a man who could manipulate digital systems with surgical precision. He used encrypted networks to create fake identities, complete with social security numbers and credit histories. Each identity served a purpose. Some opened bank accounts, others registered shell companies. To cover his tracks, he transferred small amounts from dozens of accounts, making it nearly impossible for investigators to detect the thefts. His system was so sophisticated that even banks considered the transactions legitimate. Richard often justified his crimes to himself. He told himself he wasn't hurting anyone directly, that banks had insurance, and that he was simply taking from a system designed to exploit people like him. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't driven by need or revenge. He was driven by control, the thrill of deceiving others and staying one step ahead. Each time a transaction went unnoticed, it reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. For years, his operation ran flawlessly. There were no mistakes, no unexpected inquiries, no signs of exposure. It was as if he'd built an invisible empire that existed only in the shadows of legitimate business. His family continued to live their comfortable life, unaware that every piece of furniture, every vacation, and every school tuition payment was funded by lies. Then came the moment that would change everything. It wasn't a major error, not even something obvious. It was a small, almost meaningless detail, a single transaction that didn't quite align with the others. A retired veteran in Florida noticed strange activity in his investment account, a few withdrawals that didn't match his spending. It was insignificant enough to overlook, but he filed a complaint anyway. That complaint landed on the desk of an FBI analyst in Washington. What seemed like a minor financial discrepancy would soon expose one of the most complex identity fraud schemes the Bureau had ever encountered. And while Richard Hale slept peacefully in his Charleston home, unaware that a thread had just been pulled from his carefully woven web of lies, the first step toward his downfall had already begun. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly, almost invisibly. Richard had just returned from a short trip to Atlanta when he noticed something odd in one of his offshore accounts. A routine transfer he had scheduled hadn't gone through. The system rejected the transaction, citing a verification issue. At first he thought it was a minor glitch, but when he tried again using a different account and received the same error, a cold unease settled in his chest. Something had changed in the background, something beyond his control. 2 days later, the story reached the local news. A retired veteran in Florida had filed a complaint after discovering suspicious withdrawals from his investment account. The report mentioned that the name associated with the account was one of Richard's fabricated clients, Daniel Mercer. Richard stared at the screen for a long time, his heart pounding. It was impossible, he thought. He had used that alias for years, carefully laundering money through small, untraceable movements. The idea that someone had noticed, much less reported it, felt impossible. Still, he couldn't afford to ignore it. That night, after Laura and the children were asleep, Richard sat at his desk and began to erase traces of his network. He deleted entire directories of data, reformatted drives, and set automated programs to purge his activity logs. Every keystroke was measured, calm, and deliberate. To anyone else, it might have looked like panic. But to Richard, it was control, the act of staying ahead. He told himself that this was only a temporary scare, that his system was too complex for anyone to fully unravel. Yet even as he worked, a quiet fear gnawed at the edge of his thoughts. The next week, 2 FBI agents arrived at his office under the guise of a routine inquiry. They were polite and professional, asking questions about cybersecurity breaches and identity theft affecting financial consultants. Richard played his part perfectly. He offered detailed explanations, printed reports, and even shared access to some of his business files. His calm, confident demeanor convinced them he was simply another professional dealing with the fallout of a data breach. When the meeting ended, one of the agents thanked him for his cooperation. They shook hands. Richard smiled, steady and convincing, but behind that smile his mind raced. The FBI wasn't visiting random consultants. They were narrowing in on something or someone. The fact that they'd shown up meant his name was already on a list. He knew how investigations like this worked. They started broad, then focused tighter until they found a lead. He couldn't let himself become that lead. Over the following days, Richard tightened his defenses. He changed digital identities, rerouted money, and created false trails to make it appear as if his own company had been hacked. He even planted fabricated emails suggesting that an outside party had stolen his client's information. It was a masterful illusion, crafted with precision and patience. When agents returned with follow-up questions, he appeared to be the model of cooperation, a man wronged by unseen criminals. His explanations were so meticulous that even the lead investigator began to doubt the direction of the case. For a while, it worked. The FBI began looking into other possible suspects. including international hacking groups that had previously targeted financial institutions. Richard's name faded from active discussion, but it wasn't removed completely. Deep within the Bureau's cybercrime division, a young analyst named Claire Donovan continued to study his records. Something about him didn't fit. His background was too clean, his professional history too perfect. She couldn't explain it, but her instincts told her that Richard Hale was not who he appeared to be. Meanwhile, Richard's life returned to its polished rhythm. The barbecues continued, the school events, the dinners with friends. Laura noticed that he was quieter than usual, but when she asked, he simply blamed stress from work. He even scheduled a fake business trip to New York as a precaution, using it as cover to move his remaining offshore funds into new accounts. Yet despite all his cleverness, a shadow had begun to form behind him. The FBI wasn't closing the case, and they were expanding it. They followed the smallest traces, cross-referencing old transaction logs and identity records. That single complaint from Florida had opened a crack in Richard's carefully built empire. And now, through that tiny opening, investigators were beginning to see the outlines of something vast. Late one night, as Richard reviewed his remaining accounts, he noticed a login attempt from an unrecognized IP address, traced to Washington, D.C. He froze. For the first time in years, he felt genuine fear. The FBI wasn't just investigating him anymore. They were watching him in real time. Still, Richard refused to panic. He had survived this long by trusting his intellect. With one last deep breath, he shut down his computer, packed a single flash drive into a small metal case, and locked it away in his office safe. If the FBI wanted to find him, they would have to outsmart him. And in his mind, that was something no one had ever done. The deeper the FBI dug into Richard Hale's background, the more inconsistencies they uncovered. At first, they thought it was just incomplete data. A missing school record here, a gap in employment there. But as the weeks went by, the gaps widened until they realized something astonishing. Richard Hale, as he was known in Charleston, didn't exist before 1998. There were no official records of his childhood, no college transcripts, no traceable family history. His identity appeared fully formed, like someone had written him into existence out of thin air. Agent Claire Donovan was the first to notice the irregularities. She requested a background verification from multiple states, cross-checking Social Security data and birth certificates. What she found was unsettling. The Social Security number Richard used belonged to a boy who had died in a car accident in Ohio 30 years earlier. Every document linked to Richard's identity, driver's license, passport, tax forms, was based on that stolen foundation. The man living comfortably in South Carolina had built his entire life on the identity of a dead child. Meanwhile, Richard sensed the shift long before anyone came knocking. He had always believed the secret to survival was anticipation, not reaction. Through encrypted alerts, he noticed background checks being run on his digital records. Someone was searching for connections between his aliases. That alone confirmed his suspicions. The FBI had reopened their focus on him. Instead of panicking, he refined his next move. He knew his time in Charleston was coming to an end, and he began quietly preparing to vanish. He started by dismantling his online network. Dozens of fake profiles, company websites, and investment platforms disappeared overnight. The digital personas he had created, investors, consultants, business partners, were systematically erased. Each had served its purpose. One had moved stolen funds, another had handled communication with clients who didn't exist. Now they were nothing but empty shells. Richard was careful not to make abrupt changes that could trigger alerts. Every deletion looked natural, every disappearance planned. As the investigation intensified, the FBI traced financial movements across multiple states. They uncovered names that repeated in patterns: Samuel Dean, Michael Trent, James Adler. all connected through electronic trails that led back to accounts Richard had created years before. But each name came with its own identity, supported by fabricated histories and official records that seemed legitimate. It was as if multiple people were living within the same digital space, each reinforcing the other's existence. Claire realized they were dealing with something far more complex than simple fraud. It was an interconnected web of false lives, a digital ecosystem designed to protect one central figure. In Charleston, Richard continued to act like nothing was wrong. He still attended community events, still picked up his kids from school, and still smiled when neighbors waved. To Laura, everything seemed fine, though she noticed a subtle tension in his eyes. He began locking his office door more often and spending longer hours inside. She thought it was work stress, but in truth, Richard was preparing the final stage of his escape. He transferred their savings into hidden offshore accounts and created new identification documents under a fresh alias, one he had been developing for years, just in case. The name on those documents was Thomas Green. One evening, as he reviewed the final details of his plan, Richard received a call from a client, or rather, an FBI agent posing as one. The voice on the line was calm, polite, but probing. They asked about an investment in a company Richard knew didn't exist. It was a test, and he recognized it instantly. He ended the call with his usual composure, but he knew what it meant. The FBI was no longer circling him. They were closing in. The next morning, he made his move. He transferred a final sum of money through a web of offshore accounts, shut down every computer in his office, and walked out of his home for what would be the last time. He left no note, no sign of distress, nothing to suggest he wouldn't return. His car was later found at a small airport outside Charleston, but there was no record of him boarding any flight. His phone was left in the glove compartment, powered off. When the FBI raided his home, they found almost nothing. No documents, no drives, no clues about where he'd gone. Every trace of his secret life had been wiped clean. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. But for Claire Donovan, the most chilling discovery came days later when she dug deeper into the aliases he had used. Among the dozens of fake identities, she found one that stood out. A Thomas Green who had been quietly paying taxes for over 5 years, living in another state under a different name. The realization hit her like a wave. Richard Hale hadn't just planned to disappear. He had already been living his next life all along. The morning Richard Hale disappeared was as ordinary as any other. Laura remembered hearing the shower run, the sound of coffee brewing, and the soft click of the front door closing. She assumed he was heading to work early, as he often did when a client deadline loomed, but by late afternoon, when he hadn't answered her calls or returned home, a faint unease crept into her thoughts. By evening, that unease turned into alarm. She called his office, and when a secretary told her he hadn't come in all day, the world she knew began to tilt out of focus. By midnight, the police were notified. The next morning, Richard's car was found parked neatly at a small regional airport just outside Charleston. The keys were still in the ignition, but there was no luggage, no wallet, and no sign of a struggle. Security cameras captured him entering the lot early that morning, but there was no footage of him leaving. No ticket purchases, no flight records, and no trace of him inside the terminal. It was as if he had walked into thin air and never returned. The FBI, already monitoring his activities, immediately took over the investigation. They searched the Hale residence, combing through every drawer, computer, and document. What they found was unsettling in its precision. His home office had been stripped bare. No files, no digital devices, no physical records of his business. Every account they tried to trace led to a dead end. The house, once filled with signs of a thriving career, now looked like the home of a man who had been planning to disappear for months. For Laura, the days that followed were a blur of confusion and disbelief. She couldn't comprehend how the man she had shared her life with, the father of her children, could simply vanish. Investigators began asking questions about his habits, his work, his friends. With each answer she gave, she began to realize how little she truly knew him. Every part of their life together had been built on carefully crafted illusions. Even their marriage certificate, when checked by federal agents, turned out to have been signed by an officiant who didn't exist. The FBI's search quickly expanded beyond South Carolina. Financial transactions in Belize, Panama, and Switzerland began to surface, all connected to the same web of offshore accounts. A new identity appeared on their radar: Michael Trent, a supposed investor who had recently opened several accounts under that name. Surveillance footage from a bank in Belize City showed a man resembling Richard withdrawing cash. Though the video was grainy, the agents recognized the distinctive posture, the same tilt of the head, the same cautious awareness in his movements. Before they could move on the lead, the trail went cold again. The accounts were closed, the funds transferred elsewhere, and Michael Trent disappeared just as quickly as he had appeared. Each time the FBI thought they had cornered him, he slipped through another loophole, erasing every trace behind him. It became clear that Richard hadn't simply run away. He had orchestrated his vanishing act with meticulous precision. Every step had been planned months, perhaps years in advance. Forensic analysts working on his digital trail discovered that his fake identities had been layered in a way that mimicked real people. Each one had its own history: taxes paid, bills settled, and even social media interactions with other false profiles. Together they created an interlocking network of digital ghosts, all leading back to a single architect. The scale of his deception stunned investigators. It wasn't just financial fraud, it was identity engineering at a level few had ever seen. Back in Charleston, the community struggled to accept the truth. Neighbors who once admired Richard now whispered about his double life. Some refused to believe he was guilty, convinced that he must have been forced into hiding, but Laura knew better. The realization came slowly and painfully. The man she had loved had never existed. The husband, the father, the provider, all of it was a performance. Months passed without a single credible sighting. The FBI theorized he was living under a new identity somewhere in South America, using the millions he had stolen to start over. But there was no proof, no confirmation. Only speculation and silence. Laura eventually sold their home and moved away with her children, trying to rebuild what remained of their lives. Still, for the agents who had chased him, the case was far from over. They believed Richard Hale, or whatever his real name was still out there, watching, waiting, and perhaps even creating another life under a different name. Each unanswered question only deepened the mystery of how one man could fool not just his family and friends, but the FBI itself, and then simply disappear into the world without leaving a single trace behind. Years passed before the name Richard Hale surfaced again. For most, he was a ghost story, the man who fooled the FBI and vanished without a trace. News outlets occasionally revived his case in documentaries or podcasts, each version filled with speculation about where he might be. Some claimed he was living in Europe under a new identity. Others suggested he'd been killed by someone he'd crossed. The truth, however, remained a mystery. The FBI kept his file open, though it had long been moved to the cold case division. Claire Donovan, the analyst who had followed his trail from the beginning, never stopped looking. Something about the case haunted her. The idea that a man so intelligent and deliberate could simply cease to exist. In 2019, a small-town newspaper in Oregon published a human interest story about a quiet local mechanic named Thomas Green. The article described him as private but kind, a man who kept to himself and never spoke about his past. The accompanying photograph showed a man older, thinner and wearing glasses, but his expression carried the same calm, watchful quality Claire remembered from the surveillance photos of Richard Hale. Facial recognition software confirmed her suspicion. Thomas Green and Richard Hale were almost certainly the same person. A team was dispatched immediately. They arrived in the small Oregon town within 48 hours, setting up surveillance near the repair shop where Thomas worked. The man they watched was careful but predictable. He opened the shop at 7 a.m. sharp, serviced cars, and closed by 5. He paid his bills in cash and never used credit cards. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who preferred solitude. He seemed to have built a simple, quiet life, the perfect disguise for someone who once thrived on deception. When agents finally made their move, he was gone. The apartment he rented above the shop was empty. No clothes, no personal belongings, not even fingerprints. On the kitchen counter, they found a single envelope with a note inside. It read, "You can't catch someone who doesn't exist." The handwriting was identical to Richard's. Inside a locked drawer, investigators discovered a small flash drive. When decrypted, it revealed encrypted FBI correspondence, emails, case notes, and internal communications related to his own investigation. Somehow Richard had gained access to federal files, reading updates on the very people hunting him. The discovery stunned the Bureau. It meant that even while he was in hiding, he had managed to infiltrate the system that pursued him. He had been tracking their movements as closely as they were tracking his. How he obtained the data was never fully understood. Some believed he had planted digital backdoors into government databases years before he disappeared, allowing him to monitor any activity linked to his name. Others speculated he had help from someone inside the Bureau, though no evidence ever supported that theory. The truth remained buried behind layers of encryption that even federal experts couldn't completely break. For the public, the story became legend, the deceptive husband who fooled the world and vanished twice. For Claire, it was unfinished business. She spent months analyzing every file, every clue left behind. The encrypted folders on the flash drive hinted at more than identity fraud. Hidden among the data were references to other names, other false identities that had never been connected to Richard before. It was as if he had built a network of successors, people who might be living under the identities he created, continuing his legacy of deception. Despite renewed efforts, no further trace of Richard Hale was ever found. His fingerprints didn't match any new records, and no verified sightings surfaced again. Occasionally, financial anomalies resembling his old patterns appeared, small transactions through obscure accounts, always ending in dead ends. Each one felt like a reminder that somewhere, he might still be out there quietly watching. Laura rebuilt her life, choosing never to speak of him publicly again. For her, the name Richard Hale symbolized betrayal and loss, a shadow that had stolen years of her life. The FBI eventually closed the case without resolution, labeling it one of the most sophisticated identity crimes in modern history. But in the minds of those who chased him, there was always the lingering thought that he had planned everything, even the discovery in Oregon, as part of his design. Perhaps he wanted them to find the note. Perhaps he wanted the myth to live on, or perhaps somewhere under another name in another quiet town, Richard Hale was already living his next life, blending into another community that saw him as an ordinary man. If so, it would be the perfect ending to his story. Not a capture, not a confession, but a quiet continuation of deception. Because for Richard Hale, disappearing wasn't the end. It was his greatest achievement.